Dear students, I welcome you all to my today's session, which is on sociology of consumption. Sociology of consumption is a relatively new field of inquiry. However, its roots can be traceable to the 19th century. It has become more popular over the recent years in conjunction with the sociological reality of consumption becoming a central feature of social life today. So, in this module, which is an introductory module on sociology of consumption, we will introduce the following themes, and some of the questions that we will discuss are the following. What does sociology of consumption focus on? How do we understand consumption as a social phenomenon, and how has it changed over time? What are some of the important theoretical works within this field of sociology of consumption, and how do they help us to understand the nature of changes in the consumption as a central feature of social life today? And finally, we will also deal with some of the new notions around consumption which are dominant today. So, coming to the structure of the module, first we will deal with what is consumption and what is sociology of consumption, and then we will go over to some of the theoretical contributions to this field of sociology of consumption. The third part of the module will deal with the theme of globalization and consumer culture, and finally we will also talk about some of the new ways of thinking about consumption, and here we will focus on the notion of sustainable consumption. So, let us begin. The first part of the lecture is about what is sociology of consumption. So, as you know that although consumption takes place in all human cultures, it is only in the 20th century that consumption has begun to appear as a foundational feature of social life and not just an epiphenomenal feature. And sociology of consumption focuses on consumption as a central feature of social life today. And some of the themes that this field of inquiry deals with would include the relationship between consumerism, identity and social status, the rise of consumer culture and its relation to globalization, and the relationship between consumer identity and citizenship, and so on and so forth. So, first we will go to what is consumption. So, Campbell gives us a very simple but comprehensive definition of consumption, and I quote from him: a simple working definition, one that identifies consumption as involving the selection, purchase, use, maintenance, repair and disposal of any given product or service. So, as you can see that this is quite a broad based definition of consumption, where we are talking about not only the use of certain products and services, but we are also talking about its disposal, its repair, its reuse and so on and so forth. And you must keep in mind that consumption can be in the form of goods, or it can be in the form of consumption of services, and in either case it can be material or non-material. And now we go over to the second part of today's lecture, which is on the theoretical contributions to sociology of consumption. And we will begin with one of the earliest theorists who has contributed to this field of inquiry as early as the 19th century, this thinker had contributed to this work in terms of situating consumption as a central feature of social life. So, basically this is one of the first works to engage with the notion of consumption in its own right. And the book in which he discusses this work is titled as The Theory of Leisure Class, which was published in 1899. And two of the central concepts that he discusses in this particular book are conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure. In this book, he shows how the nouveau riche, which he calls the leisure class of his contemporary society, subscribed to lavish consumption to basically manifest their social status and social distinction. Another concept that he deals with is the concept of conspicuous leisure, where he says that conspicuous leisure is a feature of social life of the leisure class. Again, this is a class which can afford a non-productive use of time, unlike the working class. And why do they engage in non-productive use of time? Because that is also a way of displaying their social status. This is what Veblen talks about, Thorstein Veblen. Now we move over to another significant contribution to this field of sociology of consumption, and it was in the 1930s in Germany that a school emerged which was known as the Frankfurt School, and they developed a theory of mass culture. So, basically they developed a theory that deals with the realm of culture. This was a neo-Marxian school of thought that developed a critique of capitalism, and some of the important members of the school included Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. So, to develop a critique of capitalism, what they did is to argue that it was a realm of culture which was essentially important to understand the nature of capitalism and how capitalism gets to be reproduced and sustained over time. They argue that it was a realm of culture which essentially numbs the critical sensibilities of individuals in capitalism. And in their most famous work, which is known as the Dialectic of Enlightenment, they coined the term what is known as the culture industry to refer to the new forms of popular entertainment, and they argued that all art forms such as cinema, music, etc. were now being mass produced. In the same way, the cars and the jeans were being produced in the factory. So, what was the consequence? What was the consequence of mass production of cultural goods? And they will identify three major consequences. First, they argue that it has resulted in standardized, patterned, and passive forms of consumption. Second, this production of mass produced cultural goods also leads to the loss of individuality and spontaneity and the exercise of choice. And the third consequence that they mention is that all art and avant-garde is reduced to mass culture. In other words, it is no longer possible to make a clear-cut distinction between high culture and low culture, because every form of art is now commercially driven. Thus, the Frankfurt School largely views the consumers as a victim of mass culture, where they do not have much agency or ability to exercise their own choices. And now we move over to the third important conceptualization within the field of sociology of consumption. And one of the most illustrious names in this domain is that of the French thinker Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu's contribution to sociology of consumption is mainly found in his book, which is titled as Distinction, which was published in 1984. And in this book, he introduced the concept of cultural capital, and he argues that cultural capital is a marker of class position in addition to the traditional basis of economic capital or wealth. So, what is this notion of cultural capital? Cultural capital includes, according to Bourdieu, the knowledge, the skills, education and other related advantages that an individual has inculcated over time, and it largely derives from their class habitus. And cultural capital is a very important basis of class formation as well as class reproduction. And the other concept that Bourdieu introduces, and which is very important for us to recognize, is the concept of taste. So, Bourdieu argues how taste, which also derives from class habitus, operates as a mechanism for maintaining, reproducing and struggling over class distinction. So, taste is very fundamental to maintain class distinction. So, the upper classes distance themselves from other classes based on a creation of a binary of taste for necessity versus taste for luxury, and these are his own terms. So, basically taste of necessity is an appreciation of, for example, food that is filling. On the other hand, taste for luxury would refer to the aesthetic practices of dining that the upper classes would follow. So, Bourdieu argues that this struggle over what counts as culture of necessity, or what is necessity, and what counts as superfluous consumption, which is a luxury, then becomes a field of contestation, and this determines the social and cultural distinction of particular classes. And now we move over to another significant contribution to the field of sociology of consumption, and to speak about this part, we must focus on the rise of a set of studies which was called the cultural studies in the 1980s. So, during the 1980s, the field of sociology of consumption was transformed. The sociology of consumption acquired a centrality as a field of study, with a host of works emerging during this time that sought to recognize consumption as a central feature of social life. The focus shifted from the realm of production to the realm of consumption, which began to be seen as not as an epiphenomena, but something that is worthy of study in its own right. And this shift coincided with the development of semiotic studies, which dealt with the meaning of consumption and a recognition of the important role of culture and the rise of postmodernism. All these developments were part and parcel of a broader cultural turn in sociology. So, what do these cultural studies do? What do they speak about? What do they focus on? And how do they analyze culture as a social phenomena? There is something distinctive about this. So, I will quote from Blue, and this is what this work has to say about the contribution of cultural studies to sociology of consumption. These cultural studies scholars propose that studies of consumption should focus attention toward symbolic nature of goods and services in order to understand the meanings behind consumption. Understanding consumption choices not merely as instrumental, but as expressive of emotions and desires, of individual agency and choice. This work analyzed social and symbolic exchange by studying how consumption of signs, symbols and images created and communicated social meaning. For example, how brands operate as signs and have symbolic value to establish social status and identity. In relation to this, we will also discuss the particular theme that emerged also roughly during this time, which is postmodernism and consumption. Postmodern consumer society differs in important ways from the modern consumer society. And these postmodern thinkers point out two interesting developments. First, how the subjects of consumption seems to be changing, and second, new sites and processes of consumption have also emerged. So, according to them, consumers in a postmodern world are not dupes of consumer society, but actively appropriate consumer objects and the culture which is propagated through advertisement and image production to create complex and multiple consumer identities. Second, there are new sites and processes of consumption which have appeared in the postmodern world, such as the casino, theme parks, cyber malls, cruise ships, themed restaurants, and so on and so forth. The spectacles that define these new sites provide the consumer with greater opportunities to consume and to consume in ways that are experienced as aesthetically positive and fun. And now we move over to the third part of our module today, which is on globalization and consumer culture. So, there has been a debate in the sociology of consumption in relation to globalization regarding whether consumption is becoming more standardized across the globe. Some scholars such as Ritza have argued that the rising power of the transnational corporations and their global penetration across the world is leading to increased standardization of consumption around the world. He coined the term McDonaldization to refer to this process of cultural homogenization which is happening across the world, where American culture seems to be the dominant influence across the different cultures. Calden and Miller, on the other hand, argue that there is a simultaneous process of localization which is at work, and that the global culture has powerful influence, but it works through the process of localization. In other words, individuals and groups in specific countries incorporate global products and images into their local and national cultural context, either combining them with local products and services, or rejecting them, or reinterpreting them in local terms. In India, there has been a host of studies which have emerged that look at the consumption practices in the post-liberalization phase, and they have focused on what is called the new middle class. And the new middle class has been construed through public discourses as a consuming class, wherein it is their identity as a consumer which has become central to defining them. And this has happened because of opening up of the market post 1990s, which meant that this class had greater access to the global branded products, and they had increasing purchasing power, which ultimately meant that the middle class was being hailed as the new powerful class, heralding the onset of a new India. The study of new consumption, which mostly focused on the new middle class, has largely focused on how consumption shapes social identity. And they have understood people's understanding and behaviors around consumption to understand how consumption practices are geared to meeting aspirations and in turn deciding class belonging and distinction. And now we come to the last part of today's session, which is on the idea of some of the new ways of thinking about consumption, and we will focus on the idea of sustainable consumption. The high levels of consumption promoted by consumer culture, particularly in the developed countries, however, has come under close scrutiny over the recent times. And the concern has been about sustainability of such high standards of consumption. It has been recognized that unsustainable consumption is a major cause of environmental degradation today across the world, and the developed countries have contributed significantly to this. So, the challenge that faces us is to find a path towards a more sustainable future, and it requires radically different ways of living and consuming. Sustainable consumption refers to the use of material, products, energy and immaterial services in a way that their use minimizes impact on the environment, and that human needs can be met only in the present but also for future generations. To discuss some of the problems with this high level of consumption in India, I will discuss some of the issues which have been flagged by Van Wessel, and I quote, "It is important considering major societal challenges India is facing with, including the threat and the already felt implications of climate change in terms of drought, flooding and food security, ever increasing waste and serious air pollution. This is a matter of importance to Indian society at large, including middle class consumers themselves. It's also a question of social justice, with the poor often likely to be more at risk and suffering relatively more of the adverse consequences of the expansion of consumption. It is also a question of taking a broader outlook, considering consumption as more than an Indian question, taking into account the limits of the Earth's capacity to sustain consumption." So basically, she talks about two issues here. One is the issue of environmental degradation, the other is the issue of social equity. Unsustainable consumption is a threat to both of these concerns. Finally, I conclude today's session So basically in this session we have discussed the following. We began with what is meant by sociology of consumption, and then we discussed some of the theoretical contributions to sociology of consumption. We also discussed the particular theme of globalization and consumer culture, and finally we discussed some of the new notions of consumption such as sustainable consumption. Although the beginnings of sociology of consumption can be traced from the 19th century onward, it is only in recent times that it has become a distinctive field of study, and it has developed prominently with a due recognition of the importance of consumption as a central feature of social life today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will attend my next session. Thank you.